What is happening, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back to offer my spoiler-free review of the new show, The Terminal List, starring Chris Pratt, coming to Amazon on Friday, July 1st. This show is based on the book by Jack Carr. I think it was published back in 2018. And I have to admit that neither the show nor the book were really on my radar until about a week ago when a buddy of mine by the name of Nick Berry, who kind of single-handedly keeps the publishing industry alive with all the books that he reads, he gave me a heads up that not only was the show coming, but that the book was well worth a look. And he was right. Bought the book, I also bought the audiobook, and I just fell into it. I'd basically kind of take turns reading the book, and then I'd go for a jog and listen to the audiobook, etc. and so forth. But Jack Carr is a Navy SEAL, or I don't know. When it comes to terminology, I'm going to get out of my lane very, very quickly. I don't know if you're ever considered a retired SEAL or if you're like a SEAL for life, whether you're active or not. In any event, Jack Carr is a Navy SEAL. And not only is the book just a riveting thriller that's just kind of pulse-pounding and really fast-paced and expertly constructed and just really tightly constructed as well, it has this astonishing authenticity that you just can't get if all you've ever done is watch a lot of film and television and now you want to write, a cool revenge saga. When it comes to the terminology, the equipment, the tactics, just the attitude, the philosophy, just the belief system, there, as the old expression goes, or like the old song goes, ain't nothing like the real thing, baby. And so I was just floored by the experience. So I went into the show immensely excited because Chris Pratt was the author's first pick to play the character of James Reese. But I was also excited by the fact that Antoine Fuqua was one of the directors of one of the episodes, the pilot episode. And for people who don't know who he is, he did Training Day back in 2001, which I think that still might be his best movie, but he's got things like Shooter and The Equalizer to his name as well. The Magnificent Seven, which he did with Chris Pratt. Anyway, he's a big-time director. And if this is your first time hearing about the Terminal List, once again, this will be spoiler-free, but I will be discussing things that come from the trailer or like the official synopsis. But here is the premise. The series follows James Reese, a.k.a. Chris Pratt, after his entire platoon of Navy SEALs is ambushed while on a covert mission. Reese returns home to his family with conflicting memories of the event and questions about his culpability. As new evidence comes to light, Reese discovers dark forces working against him, endangering not only his life, but the lives of those he loves. But if you're looking for an even better synopsis, as well as a taste or a writing sample from Mr. Jack Carr himself, this comes from the preface to this novel before the story even gets started, where he writes, "This is a novel of revenge. The Terminal List explores what could happen when an apex predator, a warrior at the top of his game, is thrown into a situation from which there is no return. It is about what could happen when societal norms, laws, regulations, morals, and ethics give way for a man of extraordinary capability, hardened by war, and set on a course of reckoning. A man who is, for all practical purposes, already dead." Now, not only is that some damn good writing, but it perfectly sums up the emotion, the drive, just the style and tone of this story overall, and one that gets my highest possible recommendation if you're in the mood for just a good, mean and nasty, kick-ass thriller. And as I mentioned before, this is a hardcore revenge saga, and so I went into this show super pumped, super excited. And so it pains me to acknowledge that while they did not ruin the book with the show, they make frequent attempts to do so. And so I think if you're excited about the show, 100% watch it. It is an enjoyable show. It's a very solid kind of base hit in a lot of ways, and I think people will enjoy it. But man, nothing's more frustrating to me than when you see a showrunner and basically a writer's room take something that already works. The first book in this series was a monster bestseller. You've already tested the story with an audience, and they responded very enthusiastically. It made a lot of money. Why not just stick to the book as much as possible? Instead, they introduce new characters, new subplots, just a lot of filler. And I would say that 99% of the time, any new material that's added to the story that's not from the book, it just feels inert. It feels stagnant. It feels boring. It just brings the story to a screeching halt. And it was just so goddamn frustrating because they had the budget, they had the platform, they had 8 episodes to tell the full story, and they just chose to screw it up in a lot of ways. And so I can't give the show a complete full-throated recommendation And I guess the most damning criticism I have of the show is that if I had not read the book, if I was not invested in the story and wanted to see how good a job they did with the show, I probably would have given up after like episode 2, just judging the show on its own merits. Around episode 3 or 4, the show makes this big comeback and starts to resemble the book a lot more. Then around episode 6, it gets totally derailed and goes off into total made-up La La Land. And I'm not one of those purists that thinks that a writer's room or a showrunner can't make their own contributions to a show, but I would point to Jack Reacher as a really successful example recently where they took the book Killing Floor and they more or less just tried to make a show that was a faithful adaptation of the book. And Jack Reacher was on the exact same platform, Amazon, and it seemed to find a very receptive audience. And I guess hindsight being 2020, showrunner and show creator David DiGilio, if I'm saying his name correctly, I think if there's a bad guy in this whole scenario, I'm going to point to him. This is the first show that I've watched that he's worked on. His credits are the movie 8 Below. He also did the show Traveler. He did a TV movie called Warrior. He did Strange Angel. And now he did this. And so he's a relatively new writer and inexperienced. And sorry, David, I'm not going to throw Chris Pratt under the bus because I love him. And also I should mention that Chris Pratt optioned the book before it even got published. I don't know how he got his hands on, I guess they call it like the galleys, but basically before a book gets published, it's kind of in circulation for a while. But Chris Pratt, he optioned the book. He loved the book. Clearly had the best intentions when it came to bringing the Terminal List to the screen. And so if I'm going to point to somebody who probably introduced all the flaws and weaknesses into the show, it's going to be the person who was responsible for running the show, David DiGilio. And there's no bigger cliche in the world than when people say, oh, that show was fine, but the book was better, or that movie's fine, but the book was better. But sometimes it's true. And in this case, the book is better. And I think the reason that the book is better is that it has this total like purity and clarity of purpose from the point of view of the protagonist. Once again, I've got to tap dance around certain spoilers, but you learn early on some details about the degree to which James Reese and his fellow Navy SEALs have been betrayed. And it immediately puts you on the side of the protagonist where you're like, fuck yeah, I want to watch this guy go out and just fuck up the bad guys. And it's incredibly satisfying as he slowly but surely goes through his list and starts crossing out names. It's almost like Kill Bill with like, crossing out the names. It's a very simple format, but the way it's told in the book, it starts with his first kind of assassination, then it goes back in time, fills in a little bit, and then you kind of periodically get to kind of go back and forth where you see details from the mission that went horribly wrong, you see details from his family life, and then slowly but surely the book works its way inexorably towards this really satisfying conclusion. And the book was so successful that he has subsequently written several more starring the character. But where the show gets it wrong, and this is not a spoiler because it's emphasized heavily in the trailer, the show decided to lean all the way in very heavily on this additional plot wrinkle that perhaps James Reese might be an unreliable protagonist in terms of like what we're seeing from his subjective point of view due to brain trauma and PTSD, etc., that perhaps he's not remembering things clearly. And so for the first few episodes, you don't quite know, is this guy just a conspiratorial, paranoid madman, or are the people that he's paranoid about really after him? And that sets the show apart from the book quite distinctly. And it makes the first few episodes of the show kind of a bummer. They're dark, they're moody, they're depressing, whereas the book, right out of the gate, the very first chapter, boom, you get one really satisfying kill on the terminal. It's like, all right, fuck yeah, I'm invested. This kicks ass. This is exciting. And the show really takes its time to get up and running. And what's infuriating is just how much material gets thrown out in exchange for kind of bland, generic, second-rate storytelling that you can find in pretty much any show out there. And there's an expression that I like to use when I'm complimenting something where I say something was all killer, no filler, but that does not hold true with the show. There is plenty of filler, and it didn't have to be this way. The show invests an enormous amount of time in this FBI agent, Tony Layun, and he has a giant cast of characters in support of him, and all that crap is brand new. And then the show also takes very well-established characters like Katie Burinek and completely changes their story, completely changes their relationship to James Reeves, completely changes the way they express themselves and the way they interact with people. And it's like, once again, Katie Burinek was a very well-written character. Just shove the book into the fucking camera. Or the Secretary of Defense, Secretary Hartley, fascinating character in the book, totally bland and boring in the show, and she's played by one of my high school crushes, Jean Triplehorn. But goddamn, it's just so frustrating. I was gnashing my teeth at all these unforced errors because they already had the perfect blueprint and battle plan, and they chose to go another direction. And the show oftentimes feels kind of decompressed and lacks a sense of urgency. And it's like, if you're going to have that much wasted space in your story construction, well, then just make a movie. Like, tighten it up. Give us like a 2.5-hour riveting thriller instead of an 8-hour kind of slow show. I mean, there are scenes where it really comes to life. When you finally get to the scene in the show that dramatizes the opening chapter from the book, I was like, yes, thank you. It's finally feeling like the book again. And when it does its best to capture the spirit of the novel, the show works. And so you see how good the show could have been. But I feel like I've been bashing the show quite a bit at this point. Let me say a few complimentary things. Chris Pratt, very likable guy. He's having a monster year. He obviously has the new Jurassic World movie. He's got Thor and Love and Thunder right around the corner. And now he has this. Anytime you appear in 2 different monster movie franchises, and then you get to be the star of your own Amazon series, you're having a very good year. And I guess it was around like 2012, 13, 14, where he started doing things like the Lego movie and Guardians of the Galaxy, and Chris Pratt really started to explode as a giant movie star in his own right. But goddamn, between those 2 movies and this show, this might be a career high for him. Also, I really enjoyed Taylor Kitsch as Ben Edwards. I'm always a little vague on how to pronounce it. Is it Taylor Kitsch? Quiche? Anyway, quiche is something you eat, but Taylor Kitsch as Ben Edwards. He's one of those guys where if you are trying in any way, shape, or form to appear to be sexually attractive to the opposite sex, you might as well just throw in the towel, because as long as Taylor is out there, the battle's already lost. Like Taylor is, in a lot of ways, kind of that perfect masculine ideal, and he just he brings all that kind of brooding masculinity to the part, and he's fantastic. But another positive to this show is the performance by Riley Keough, who plays the wife of James Reese, and she is just an absolute angel in this. But like in the book, displays this incredible inner strength, like the kind of inner strength that you would have to have if your husband's line of work basically sends him overseas for long stretches of time, where on any given day he might get killed. And so at a minimum, at least the emotional core of the story is there, because James Reese, he's got incredible love and affection and loyalty to the Brotherhood of the SEALs, the guys to his right and to his left as he goes into combat. But then he has a very different kind of love for his wife and his daughter. And some of the most moving scenes from the show are the flashbacks, where we get to see all the interactions between James and his daughter. So thankfully, at least the show got those ingredients right. And I've been a big fan of Riley Keough ever since I first saw her in Mad Max Fury Road. And she also happens to be Elvis Presley's granddaughter, which is pretty goddamn cool. And then we have Jai Courtney as Steve Horn. And while the Steve Horn in the show is quite different from the Steve Horn in the book, and his storyline is dramatically different, he's at least charismatic and engaging, and it works. I wasn't constantly yelling at the screen in frustration like I was in a lot of other scenes in this show. I mean, I mentioned it before, and I mentioned it again. I'm sure he's a perfectly nice guy and a well-intentioned individual, but every single storyline involving the character Tony Layun, I couldn't believe how boring and just how routine they were. And it's almost like these scenes were cut and pasted from any other disposable, interchangeable, just bland FBI show you can think of. It's like, all right, let's just take all that and shove it into this show where they don't belong. So as you can tell, I have a lot of frustrations with this show, but I do want to pause for a moment and make a strong case for why people should check out Jack Carr's novel. This is something I've talked about on my podcast, Wrong Reel, about how after World War II and the Korean War, you had a lot of actors and filmmakers working in Hollywood who were veterans, who had experience. I mean, someone like Lee Marvin, you don't become Lee Marvin unless you have a lot of really intense experiences in the trenches, on the battlefield. Actors can't fake it. That kind of leathery world weariness has to be earned. And I think a lot of times Hollywood movies and shows suffer from a lack of expertise on that front. But what's interesting now with Jack Carr going full showbiz, I mean, he's writing best-selling books, and now he's working on TV shows and that sort of thing. It's a new version of bringing a different kind of military expertise back into the world of entertainment, and I don't think that should be overlooked or unappreciated. It's something that's been missing from a lot of shows and movies. So I'm thrilled to see that Jack Carr is basically going Hollywood. But if you watch him in interviews and that sort of thing, he's a pretty intense character, and he actually kind of looks a lot like Chris Pratt does in this, with like the beard and the hair and that sort of thing. But very interesting character, and I'll definitely be reading more of his books. And there's one aspect of the book which I wish had played more of a role in the show, but it's, as I mentioned before, the character of James Reese has this incredible purity of purpose that's very addictive for the reader. You really get emotionally invested. But what's interesting is that how over the course of the story, his soul comes close to being tainted or polluted by a lot of the tactics he resorts to in order to strike fear into the hearts of his enemies, because a lot of the things that he does, he's learned from battling insurgents and terrorists and so on and so forth. And so basically the worst elements of psychological warfare you can think of, he brings them to bear against his enemies. And there's one scene from the book, which is not in the show, but it's absolutely horrific. He's a military historian, and it's a form of torture that's been used in many different cultures for many different centuries. And I guess that was another thing that was frustrating about the show, is that really grisly, gruesome details from the book that give it that intensity and that really give you a jolt when you're reading it are lacking from the show. Like, this is not a spoiler, but at one point James Reese goes into a gentleman's club, and it's one of the most chaste, innocent gentlemen's clubs you could possibly think of. And so, once again, it's like, if you've got this great book, just adapt it and just trust it. Trust the material. This is not some weird, obscure novel that hasn't been tested in the marketplace of consumerism. It's a worldwide bestseller. Just go with it. But I can feel myself going negative again, so let me inject some positivity back into this review. It is interesting seeing Chris Pratt explore some different emotions than we typically see when he's playing, say, Star-Lord over in the MCU, where it's like pure sarcasm and jokes and quips and that sort of thing. But with this story, he gets to express a whole spectrum of emotions: hate, anger, grief, guilt, remorse. It definitely gives him more kind of emotional landscape to explore. And I think on the whole, he did a pretty damn good job. I think, once again, all the faults that I perceive with this show, it all boils down to the writing. And as the old expression goes, if it ain't on the page, it ain't on the stage. And the writing staff of this show, they just are not the equal of Jack Carr. But luckily, every once in a while, some really cool scenes or lines of dialogue from the book do make their way into the show, just in terms of the attitude that the character James Reese has towards cell phones and how they're basically like surveillance devices that happen to make phone calls and things like that. Fans of the book will get to those kinds of lines like, oh, okay, they at least read the book before they decided to start making all their massive changes to it. And there are a handful of action scenes that are ripped straight from the book and shoved into the show. But like I said earlier, around episode 6, suddenly you're going to be like, wait a second, they're just making up their own story at this point. And that's fine, but if you're going to make major changes, do them with a sense of purpose and make sure they're amazing. Don't just make changes for their own sake. Make a change that's going to blow our fucking minds. And then episodes 7 and 8 kind of feel like a little Frankenstein's monster with little elements from the book, but also plenty of new scenes that are made up by the writing staff for this show. And when it comes to all this new material that's been written for the show specifically, where it really hurt the show is in the final episode. I mean, the final episode of the show, it should be racing toward this devastating climax. And suddenly, like, there's this 20-minute scene where I was screaming at my screen like, oh my God, this is so boring. I could not believe just how the whole story was coming to a screeching halt right when it should have been really ramping up. And I guess by the end, it more or less kind of sticks the landing. And I was able to watch all 8 episodes in one fell swoop, so I'll be very curious to hear how people respond to this, because obviously the market for film and television is much larger than the market for reading books. It always has been and always will be. But just speaking in general, it's always fascinating to me when you see a show or a movie that takes something that already works, that's popular, and then kind of throwing it all out and starting over and then getting a lot of it wrong. Like if you look over my shoulder, you'll see the books for The Witcher, and the most recent season of TV was based on Blood of Elves season 2. And they just threw the book out and gave us this really crummy show. And I was like, God damn, like, you've got this giant audience that loves the books. You got this giant audience that loves the games. And you're just going to throw it all out and come up with something that's totally bland and just unremarkable. And it happens over and over and over again. And I feel like you can get away with it when you take something that's kind of lame and then make it better. Like a lot of people say great books make terrible movies, but bad books make great movies. Like if you take a really trashy bestseller, someone like Brian De Palma can turn it into a really kind of lurid sexual thriller and that sort of thing. But it's really hard to take a fantastic book and turn it into a great show or movie. And obviously there are exceptions to every rule. Like take a look at The Godfather, fantastic bestseller by Mario Puzo and classic movie by Francis Ford Coppola. If you like the book and you like the movie, like they don't clash with each other. They're both fantastic. They both stand on their own. But I worry that I'm starting to repeat myself just a tad. I've already been guilty of doing so many times over. So maybe it's time just to wrap up this review and give a shout out to the sponsor of my podcast, Manscaped. Manscaped has kind of come on board as a sponsor of Wrong Reel recently, and the world's foremost experts in men's below-the-waist grooming. Their tools are precision engineered to look after your family jewels. And if you go to manscaped.com and use the discount code WRONGREEL in all caps, you will get 20% off. I would recommend the Performance Package 4.0, but take a look at their website, see what you think, and I'll include a link in the description below to both the site as well as the discount code. And so once again, I wish I had a more favorable review to offer of this show. I hope people enjoy it more than I did, and if you totally disagree with all my conclusions, more power to you, but I'm going to be recommending the book moving forward. The show, people can kind of take it or leave it. But if you enjoyed this reaction and review, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell. And if you want to talk more, hunt me down on Twitter @GeekinOut. But I can't thank you enough for watching. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.